Hello, my name is Justin McClue, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And we have a very special guest today. We have, in the Important Cinema Club offices,
Richelle Charkot.
We're going to be talking about John Waters, a filmmaker that I will admit I'm a neophyte of, but we have two experts here today.
Oh, we should maybe mention that Richelle is programming the retrospective of John Waters that's happening at the Royal in December.
Yeah. It's December 7th to the 9th.
And I hear that you have introductions for every film by John Waters.
I have one introduction, but it's adorable. John Carpenter did an intro for us about a month ago, and it's really sweet that he did that. John Waters did a full script with art direction, and it's really, really cute. So I'm really excited.
So today we're going to talk about John Waters in relation to two of his films, Female Trouble and Polyester. Is there a reason that you guys wanted to go in that direction?
I think they're his two best films.
Yeah, I think so too. Or I think they're at least his two most representative ones.
Yeah.
Particularly Female Trouble, I think, is the one that is the kind of fullest flowering of his aesthetic and his ideas.
So how long have you been a John Waters fan, Richelle, and how did you get into him?
I think since I was a teenager. I mean, it's not an abnormal story about growing up in a small town and then seeing some kind of freaky movie and feeling kind of understood for being a little bit weird. I probably watched Pink Flamingos when I was 15, and it blew my mind.
I kind of got to him through this book that he wrote, Crackpot, The Obsessions of John Waters, which was a series of essays, or his journalism that he wrote for various magazines. And I mean, I didn't get to Susan Sontag's notes on camp until later, but I feel like I got a lot of those sorts of ideas through that book. He had a point of view of the world. I guess his overwhelming artistic project through his whole career has been everything that polite society considers beautiful is ugly. Everything that it considers ugly is beautiful. And it was almost as if he offered a unique lens through which to view the world. He had an essay in that book, John Waters' Guide to L.A., where it was all about tourist spots you could visit, like trying to find Francis the Talking Mule's grave, or trying to interview Charo's plumber, or he talked about the sad band of cultists who stand around Man's Chinese Theater so they can watch Natalie Wood's handprints get filled with water when they hose it down in the morning.
Yeah, anything he's ever written that I've read is I just obsess over. I'll read it in a day. I desperately would love to talk to him at all.
And also he kind of opens up different avenues of exploration for people. His work or his writings or his films cause you to explore a counter canon, whether it's Andy Warhol, whether it's
Douglas Sirk,
the Kuchar brothers.
I explored Douglas Sirk and I explored William Castle because of John Waters.
Yeah.
I think that for me, even though that Pink Flamingos was on the cover of my Bible, Cult Flicks and Trash Picks by the Video Hound, I give that 4 bones. There was something that I found a little bit off-putting, and I've been trying this week to put my finger on why, because I've watched a lot of films of his that I hadn't seen, and I'm like, man, I love these. These are great. And I think that it's because as a cinephile, what always interested me when I was getting into it was the idea of normal conventions being broken, whether it be in gore or martial arts. It's like an expansion of something. And from my perception, John Waters was just insanity on screen. His group of friends that were not what you're used to seeing. Look at him do all this gross stuff. I knew about Divine eating the dog shit, and for some reason I had no interest in seeing it. And I think that at the root cause was because as a cinephile when I was getting into it, what interested me was not a kind of realism as far as John Waters is portrayed on screen. These are these outsiders.
A freak show.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For me, it was more an idea, and I use this in the broadest sense of the term, a fantasy. And Pink Flamingos to me was kind of a scream as a teenager.
It's on the topic of the opposite of that, it's just literally pornography sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think when I first heard of John Waters when I was probably 12 or 13 or whenever it was, I guess I was both attracted and repulsed by this forbidden quality to them. I feel like I felt that about a lot of films over the years, especially when I was a teenager. There was something transgressive and dangerous about some of them. And also, I think the first two that I saw, of course, were Hairspray and Crybaby.
Right.
Which are so innocuous seeming.
Yeah.
But I think that if I had gotten in through those ones, I would have explored his filmography.
My old roommate, he tried to get me to introduce him to John Waters, so I started light. I started with Crybaby, and he completely hated it so much that
really?
I just never went any further. I was I can't take you any further down this hole.
Well, I actually don't think Pink Flamingos is the best starting point.
I would say maybe polyester, because
Yeah.
it's kind of like that middle ground.
Yeah, or maybe even Female Trouble could be. I think
Yeah.
Pink Flamingos...
Yeah, I started a friend on Female Trouble,
yeah.
actually. Yeah.
But, like, not only is Pink Flamingos sort of an endurance test, and it's also very raw, technically,
Yeah.
but I think it has a certain mean-spiritedness and a certain kind of anger to it that is not present in some of his later movies. Most of his later movies, I think, are kind of sweet. Or even something like Female Trouble, which is a very ferocious satire, at least has a sweet point of view.
Yeah. Like, Female Trouble definitely has more, like, jokes per beat, whereas Pink Flamingos, I feel like I screened it in early November, and I was too nervous to, like, actually watch the movie because it was sold out. It was just really funny to hear people kind of giggle, but then feel uncomfortable, and then, like, scream and, like, moan, and it was weird.
Because there's that fine line between exploiting people, right? And genuinely enjoying their presence, and they're doing this as a laugh.
Yeah.
Because even as a teenager, when I heard, oh, this filmmaker made someone eat dog shit, I was like, I don't know if I want to see that. And show me Cannibal Ferox instead.
But also, like, John Waters has been so embraced by the establishment lately. He's become this kind of, like, godfather of American culture and such kind of a cuddly talk show figure now that, you know, it's easy to forget that a movie like Pink Flamingos, it's not like it was embraced by the hippies at the time. It was politically incorrect at the time, and it's still today. It's got rape jokes. It's got an animal killed on screen. It's got incest jokes. I mean, it's a movie that resists being domesticated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was very surprised when I was looking at his biography that he was actually upper middle class when he grew up, and that while he had this kind of conservative circle around him, he was comfortable enough that, like, he injected himself into these outsiders as opposed to finding himself directly.
Well, I mean, he's kind of like a classic case of the misfit who's, like, born into stifling suburbia, who doesn't fit in high school and finds a group of like-minded peers.
And from the point that he started making short films, or when he made Multiple Maniacs, all of his pictures are suffused with this love of pop culture, which I think is very important, because he's not... I mean, he just wants to shock everybody that sees his movies, but he also genuinely loves doing these things.
Yeah, like, even when it comes to, like, something like Female Trouble, like, it's just dedicated to, like, Tex Watson.
That's, I guess, an example of the kind of harder-edged Waters of the early years. And I think he's mellowed on kind of willful provocation.
I don't even know who Tex Watson is.
He was part of the Manson gang.
Oh, yes.
Like, Waters was much more angry and willfully provocative at the time, but even though he softened a bit, I think his worldview has remained very consistent ever since those first few movies.
There's something very clear in those early movies, is that he did want it to shock, right? Because then you'd go back. Because it wouldn't matter, like, who stars in it or who these people are, because it could become a midnight success, like Pink Flamingos, because you would have to tell your friends, you need to see this.
Right.
He was a very canny careerist, I think. I just watched Pecker again, which is a movie that invites an autobiographical reading, because it's about a Baltimore photographer whose naive and technically imperfect photos are embraced by the New York intelligentsia. But the difference between Waters and Pecker is that Pecker kind of didn't know what he was doing, but Waters was very deliberate. He wanted to make movies that would shock people and that would get people talking, and that would launch him into a career.
Yeah, I did that weekend of doing Pink Flamingos, I did 2 like Q&As with Mink Stoll, and I had nonstop people asking if it was scripted, if Pink Flamingos was scripted, which is so infuriating. But everything was, like, to a T. It was completely his vision. Because
there's a belief there in an audience that they wish it was, like, improvised.
Yeah.
Because then it feels more real.
I mean, it's crazy that people are still asking that, first of all, because, like, it's so on the record at this point.
Yeah,
like, people have had 45 years to learn that the circumstances of the making of that film.
I feel like in retrospect, when I started to, like, throw it out to the audience, I should have just been like, yes, dividing the dog shit. No, it's, like, not unscripted.
But also, the movie is so overwritten. Like, the dialogue is so
totally
dense in that movie.
Yeah.
And even Pink Flamingos, which is a technically rough film, has so many goofy ideas in it that, like, how could this just be improvised?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Female Trouble was the movie that he made right after Pink Flamingos, and it also stars his muse Divine.
Well, they grew up down the street from each other.
I think so, yeah.
Which I find incredibly fascinating that two people like that could grow up anywhere near each other. A drag star who kind of wanted to skirt more into mainstream later on in his career.
Kind of John Waters, Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in polyester.
I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there was kind of this big, underground gay following for, Lana Turner and Judy Garland and other kind of screen divas. And Divine is sort of like the post-Susan Sontag version of that, where it's this man in drag who kind of looks monstrous to polite society, but John Waters is marketing him as the most beautiful woman in the world. It's like the perfect personification of his aesthetic.
I think that's what I love so much about the on-screen chemistry between Tab Hunter and Divine and Polyester, because Tab Hunter just came in and immediately treated Divine like Elizabeth Taylor, and I think that's what makes the movie work so well.
I think Female Trouble and Polyester are two movies that are really easy to compare against each other, because like Will said, Female Trouble is the final flowering of that Pink Flamingos and Multiple Maniacs John Waters, while Polyester is kind of the switch to the mainstream that now, people who are a little bit put off by those movies can finally enjoy these films, even though that they have all of the same moving parts.
All of the abortion jokes and all of the weird sex stuff.
So, Female Trouble... Divine plays Dawn Davenport, I believe is the character's name, and the film chronicles Dawn Davenport's sordid life from her childhood,
when she just wants those cha-cha heels for Christmas,
and she has a falling out with her family that ends with the Christmas tree falling on Grandma, and she gets raped, I want to say, by a passing motorist.
I think it's consensual.
Is it consensual?
I think so.
It's ambiguous.
In a scene where Divine fucks herself. Which is hilarious.
Divine, as a man, plays the motorist. She gives birth to Taffy, a bratty, bad seed child played by Mink Stole. As Dawn Davenport grows up, she is eventually wooed into a life of crime by a band of almost kind of like Warhol's Factory meets the Manson family.
Yeah.
People who espouse the philosophy that crime is beauty.
Even though that they look down on the people that they're exploiting.
In terms of Waters' aesthetic, I mean, as a craftsman, John Waters is almost at like a Kevin Smith level. Like in terms of just basics of like composition, pacing, story structure. But there's one of his films where a character says that, I think it's Cecil B. Demented, where a character says that technique is just bad style or something like that. The movie has style. It has a very coherent worldview, tacky furniture, tacky clothing.
Yeah.
It's like this movie out of thrift store finds creates a whole world. And I think the key scene is when Mink Stole and David Lockery in their ridiculous makeup and clothing are walking down just a regular Baltimore street, and they say, "Oh, look at how terrible this street is." It has no style, it has nothing. And of course, it's just a normal. In fact, you see some passersby, just regular people in the background.
I found it interesting because I watched Female Trouble after I watched all the other ones that we did for this podcast. Is that it is such a in-your-face Pink Flamingos, like, look how gross all of this stuff is.
Well, I watched this movie with a friend maybe a year or two ago, and he liked it, but he said about 2/3 of the way in, This movie is really funny, but I can't wait for it to be over, so I'm not constantly looking at ugliness.
It feels about 10 hours long, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but that there's so much stuff packed into it, and there's no noticeable structure to it. It just stuff keeps happening.
Well, it's an unrelenting experience. Like, there's no relief from the world he creates. Like, there's even that one scene where, like, Mink Stole as Taffy is, like, playing, make-believe car crash, and she's, like, pouring ketchup on herself.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a totally gratuitous throwaway scene that's just and it has no bearing on the plot, but it's just another, like, awful thing that John Waters is cramming into the movie as part of this project where everything beautiful is ugly and vice versa.
Do you remember, Richelle, what was a John Waters movie that made you go, I love John Waters and I want to know more of him?
I mean, I think it would probably just be Pink Flamingos. It was so, like, out of any sort of normal film that I had watched at that time, because I was like a teenager.
Did you kind of get into the whole like Dreamlander world? Because I think one of the appeals of him is that he cultivated this weird menagerie around him.
Yeah, absolutely. I was like obsessed with Ming Stoll for a long time. So
Really? Specifically Ming Stoll?
Yeah.
And is there a reason for that, or?
Just thought she was cool.
Did you tell her that when you were on stage?
Nope.
You're like, I was obsessed with you and I thought you were cool.
I'm a big fan of Cookie Mueller.
She's great.
Have you read any of her work? I think if Female Trouble is watchable, as I believe it is, a lot of it comes from the fact that even though there's so much quote-unquote ugliness in the movie, it has a celebratory tone to it. And it has a very consistent worldview.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's not quite as mean as some of the other stuff. I think out of that early pre-polyester like era for John Waters, I think Female Trouble is probably the most palatable.
So I watched Polyester for the first time this week, and I loved it.
Yeah, right.
If you're gonna take all the elements of early John Waters and implement it in a Douglas Sirk style melodrama, and then you put Divine in the lead role, who I gotta point out, was anybody else, I would have probably gotten annoyed with this film, because an hour of it is spent just shitting on Divine, just telling her how terrible she is. And there's that fine line just watching it. Divine's daughter in Polyester is always like thrusting in the air and dancing and stuff like that, but it's still fun to watch.
Yeah.
Well, Divine has a gravity to him. Like, improbably, I think he's a very good actor, and when you watch the movies, there's an incredible range of roles that he does. You know,
I think it's the fact that, like, with Divine and Tab Hunter, I think that they're not being cartoonish about it. Like, I think they're really going for, like, a Douglas Sirk just ode.
Yeah.
It's weird the balance that Divine has to strike, though, because on the one hand, he has to be absurd in the movie. He has to be ridiculous, but you also have to have a certain amount of sympathy for him.
Like, you don't want to take too much enjoyment in seeing him shit on the entire time.
Yeah.
You do want him to pull out of it at the end somehow. Even though that, in the context of the film, he does nothing really to do that. And I love that this is the movie where John Waters, you can tell he's like, all right, I'm going to try to do some stuff here. I'm going to do that Douglas Sirk, Dario Argento style color gel lighting. I'm going to have some steady cam moves. The film opens with like a long take that goes through the house and then finds Divine in her bedroom.
Yeah.
And that's why I loved it so much.
Technically, it's still a little dodgy.
Yes. It's shaky. It doesn't quite look right.
Yeah.
But I think that the mixture of, like you mentioned, taking it serious enough that you are invested in what's going on, but still having the absurdity that a woman chases down Divine's son in a bus and then bites his tires. Like,
some of the later, so after this, of course, he did Hairspray and Crybaby, and there was a brief Hollywood period. Some of the later ones, I think, don't get a lot of love. Richelle, do you, like, let's say after Serial Mom, what's your feeling about his filmography?
I've honestly only given it like a watch each, I think. I'm more devoted to like the earlier stuff, I think.
it's like the Dreamlander stuff when he's
definitely
involved with that group. Because even with Polyester,
Serial Mom's great though. That movie's very funny.
is that people were saying that, like, oh, he's already ejecting his Dreamlanders from his, ensemble, and it's losing some of that flavor that we originally fell in love with.
Well, every movie he did after Pink Flamingos, there were a certain amount of people saying, oh, he's sold out, or he's behind the times.
Which is inevitable.
It's inevitable, but I mean, people were giving Pecker that criticism because Pecker came out around the same time There's Something About Mary did. And I seem to recall a lot of the critical reaction around Pecker was like, oh, it's compared to the Farley brothers, he's not shocking at all anymore.
I remember Roger Ebert in his review for Pecker wrote that when they go into the gay bar and a man gets teabagged, you expect more, but nothing happens. It's weird, right? Because I'm sure John Waters was sitting there and saying a variation on, what else do you want me to do?
Yeah.
Like, I made Pink Flamingos, I made Female Trouble, I made Desperate Living. Like, how much further do you want me to go with this? And Pecker, starring a perfect Edward Furlong, his charisma leaked from his body.
Rest in peace.
Looking like he didn't.
Well, he may as well be dead. I'm sorry.
And I kept thinking, like, is this the same guy from Terminator 2? Who's, like, very animated, while in Pecker he's like, hey, guys, how's everybody doing? Eyes half closed.
Thanks.
I watched Pecker this week. I still don't love it, but I found myself warming to it on this viewing. I found something kind of endearing about John Waters' Baltimore in this film. Like, it is a Baltimore of bus stations and of laundromats and thrift stores, and I think there are very few filmmakers who have an understanding of kind of like a working class environment. I remember I visited Baltimore once for a day.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that was like, it was a key to kind of like unlocking the John Waters films for me a little bit.
Yeah.
Because like Baltimore has this perfect between New York and Texas feel to it.
Right.
It's very blue collar, working class for a lot of it. A lot of the houses in Baltimore actually have like pink flamingos unironically
Cute.
on the lawns. Not a John Waters reference either. It's just they just have pink flamingos. Pecker, I think, captures that in a way that's very endearing.
And do you think so? You said you gave up on not give up on John Waters.
Yeah,
but...
yeah. I've not revisited Pecker in a number of years.
What is it about those later movies that you don't gravitate to?
I think honestly, it just might have been youth. It wasn't the same kind of high watermark, maybe. But yeah, I don't know.
I remember I saw Dirty Shame probably right when it came out. And even at that point, not being familiar with John Waters' filmography, there was something just off about it.
There's a desperation to A Dirty Shame.
Right. Yeah.
Well, also, too, like, A Dirty Shame and has that heightened John Waters style, everybody giving very cartoonish performances. If you don't have any frame of reference for that.
But I think it's also the difference between Divine and the people that he would put in his movies who you would never expect to see in these movies versus Johnny Knoxville and Tracy Ullman or Selma Blair, is that there's a level of falseness to what's going on, even though that, like, I don't believe that anybody in Female Trouble acted like that all the time in real life. There's a level of, like, I'm just hanging out with pals and we're having fun. Yeah. There's something, special about that, which A Dirty Shame, it doesn't really exist there anymore.
Yeah, also, something about the style is lost there.
Yeah, and also, like, Serial Mom, it's Kathleen Turner giving a dramatic performance.
Yeah. I love Serial Mom. It's so funny.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, later John Waters is something that I really enjoy because he is taking these fairly generic stories but implementing his own style on it, whether it be Hairspray, which feels real in a way that you wouldn't expect, but because John Waters doing it, you have that sense of Baltimore. You have the sense that, like, Ricki Lake is like a nice girl, but she's also mean sometimes. Like, the film starts with her looking at the screen and going, oh, look at her, she's such a queer. Like, there's something special about that.
I mean, it's an interesting movie because it's half an earnest civil rights movie and half kind of like a parody of a civil rights movie.
Yeah.
His movies are, half satires of Baltimore life and half earnest depictions, love letters to Baltimore life. It's a strange tightrope that he walks. I think the only other thing I would say about John Waters is he's an example of a filmmaker whose life and his extracurricular pursuits, like his writings and his stage shows, are like extensions of the text. And each one film, I don't think, can really be viewed in isolation from the filmography. So, Pecker has a scene in a strip club where this, very butch female stripper comes out and she says, like, what the fuck are you looking at?
Isn't that one of his books, too? Like, he actually saw that? Yeah.
Well, exactly. He, like, Role Models has a whole chapter about this Baltimore stripper named Zorro.
Yeah, I remember that now.
Yeah, and the scene in Pecker, I don't think is very funny, but it's interesting when you hear about the real Zorro and you're able to apply that to it. Or
if it had appeared in one of his earlier films, though, it would have probably worked in a way that it doesn't work in Pecker.
Yeah. Or like, A Dirty Shame. If you see John Waters being interviewed around the time that movie came out, talking about all the fetishes that are in the movie, you know that this movie came out of his own, weird obsessions and preoccupations. And I feel like A Dirty Shame probably plays better if you watch it with John Waters' commentary track.
Absolutely.
It's like it's not a standalone work, and also it's a movie that can't really be viewed without, I feel like, some understanding of who Waters is and what the other movies are like. His whole career is one big soup.
So, for people that want to get into John Waters, the person, beyond his movies, Richelle, what would you recommend that they see? He's done so much stuff. He hosted an anthology horror series for a while.
Oh, about, like, women murdering their husbands.
Yeah. I think any given book that he read, or that he wrote, Car Sick is a wonderful book. He splits it up into 3 novellas, where it's the best possible scenario, the worst possible scenario, and then what actually happened. So fiction, nonfiction. And it's so funny. I would say start with any sort of book if you want to go outside of the films.
And don't start like I did with A Dirty Shame and Cecil B. Demented. Not two good starter John Waters
Not
movies.
great.
I was saying to Justin before that, you know, there's the scene in Cecil B. Demented where all of the whole gang in the movie is showing off their tattoos that are on their arms, where it's like Fassbinder, Douglas Sirk.
Otto Preminger.
Yeah, I think we should get tattoos, and mine could say Ron Howard. And yours can say Tim Story.
All our favorite journeymen. Will has Ridley Scott tattooed on his arm as well, and stuff like that. Okay, so letter time.
Oh man, you get to be here for an important Cinema Club letter segment. How about you respond to all these letters for us?
I will.
So we're going to do these completely off the top of our head, and we've had no preparation at all. If you want to send us any letters, you can contact us at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. And I haven't done it in a while, but rate and review us on iTunes.
Sure.
Because sometimes I just don't know why to get out of bed in the morning. And if I hear that ding of maybe I have a new iTunes review, it'll just let me pull those sheets off and get dressed for one more day.
I was checking the iTunes TV and movie podcast charts, looking for us, and I saw that what ranks on the list is the official podcast for the movie 18 Again, starring Zac Efron.
Which came out like 7 years ago.
And also the Couples Retreat podcast with Vince Vaughn. These are two podcasts that each had one episode in 2009. So listen, the new Important Cinema Club goal is let's beat 18 Again and Couples Retreat.
The podcast about them, not the movie.
Podcast
That's madness.
Oh, wow. Everyone loves those movies.
And we also did a Patreon episode today with Richelle and Will, because he's legally forced to appear on everything that I do. And we did it about Important Cinema Club favorite Jim Carrey and his new doc, Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, about him appearing in Man on the Moon. So give us $5 a month, please, on Patreon.
Yeah.
It's sounding incredibly desperate.
Yeah.
We forgot last week where we did an episode on
the 20th anniversary of the year 1997.
Yeah. So, shocker, Jim Carrey may appear in that as well. So, our first letter this week is from Tyler Ogilvie, and he goes, "Hey guys, huge fan of the show. I have checked out many movie podcasts over the years, and Important Cinema Club is the best of the bunch.
Suck at film spotting."
And also 17 Again podcast and Couples Retreat.
Oh, that's what it's called. 18 Again was the George Burns movie. 17 Again is the Zac Efron movie.
Yeah, where him and, is it Matthew Perry?
Yeah, they switched.
Yeah,
there was another one called
so.
18 Again that had George Burns in it. The Important Cinema Club regrets the error.
I find it amazing when you both talk about becoming avid movie fans at such young ages.
Ah, yes.
I'm 29 and just started to give into my love of cinema over the past few years. The sheer volume of great or important movies gives me paralysis at times, and I can waste hours just trying to decide what to watch. So, are you both able, and Richelle too if you can, to put together a top 10 or top 5 list of starting point movies that will start someone down various paths of discoveries? Hopefully this is different from a favorite movies list in some meaningful way. Cheers, Tyler in Calgary. Richelle, when did you get started as a movie lover?
Ooh, I mean, it would have been childhood. My dad's a big movie fan, but he was kind of exclusive to the 40s to 60s. So that was kind of all of my entry points into cinema to go further later on. To stuff that my dad hated.
Really?
Yeah,
when you
of.
rebel against your dad, it's you wouldn't get Pink Flamingos, Dad.
My parents saw Polyester on a date, by the way.
Oh,
Did
cute.
they? And that's the night that Will was conceived.
Yeah.
Nice.
They didn't like it.
Oh, no.
All right, so I'm going to start with Will on this one. We actually contacted each other and wrote off lists, and by that I mean this is all off the top of our head.
Yeah.
Will, what do you got?
Okay, so I have a few points here. It's not precisely a top 10 list, but it's a few points that could be points of entry. So for an introduction to perhaps silent or classic cinema, but especially silent cinema, I would suggest an easy entrance through Chaplin and Keaton with City Lights and The General. And then after that, you can get to the silent dramas. For introductions to European art cinema, let's get to some, real bedrock white bread choices that are also, I think, pretty entertaining and also a pretty easy way of access. So I'm suggesting Aguirre, The Wrath of God, The Seventh Seal, and A Man Escaped. For the continent of Asia, I would suggest...
Asia.
I would suggest Rashomon, Chungking Express, and Drunken Master, the three of which will lead you down various pathways. And I don't want to overlook the rest of the world, of which I'm mostly unfamiliar. So I will.
So I did a Google search to see what I should recommend.
I don't know much about African cinema, but I can tell you that Ousmane Sembène's Black Girl is a good film and a good entry point. And for the cinema of India, which is enormous, why not start with Sholay? I think, actually, if you want to learn about the avant-garde, if you want to learn about exploitation film, if you want to learn about all sorts of para-cinema or counter-cinema, John Waters is, frankly, a good entry point. So I'm going to suggest Female Trouble. And finally, here are just 4 movies that I think could be interesting entrance points and can lead you down interesting paths. Rio Bravo, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Duck Soup, and Miss 45. And I'm sorry, there are no female filmmakers on that list because I suck.
How about you, Richelle? What would you recommend? And how did you approach this list?
So I was at work and I was really busy. And
Working at the Royal Cinema.
Yeah.
Seeding budding cinephiles all across Toronto.
All day
I don't
long.
even know what that means.
Seeding?
Yeah.
Like giving birth to them?
Nothing but. So I picked some movies that I like a lot. I started with Watership Down, which is my favorite movie. As an entry point into animation, there's at times mixed medium. It's a pretty intense film. I think that could lead down a more like experimental route. For entry points into kind of American melodrama, I would say Douglas Sirk's All That Heaven Allows, or The Swimmer.
I love The Swimmer. It's so good.
The Swimmer's great. I also said Stop Making Sense because it's clearly the best concert film ever. As an entry point into American Westerns, I said The Shootist, High Noon, and The Last Sunset. They're all really captivating stories, and they don't kind of flounder like the way that some Westerns can. For entry points into Polish cinema, I said Mother Joan of the Angels and Possession. And for entry points into film noir, I said Sweet Smell of Success, Kiss Me Deadly, or The Hitchhiker. I got one woman filmmaker on that. I am ashamed.
Nice.
So the way that I approached it when I got this question is I actually started making the list and putting like Dawn of the Dead, to lead this.
Yeah, your favorites.
But I tried to pull against it and go, okay, as a young cinephile, what I really enjoyed was having films recommended to me that I'm like, I've never heard of this before, because there's less pressure on me then to be like, that is a good movie.
Right.
Like, there's so many classics that for a long time I didn't watch because I went, I don't need to see this. It's a classic. When, like, there's a reason that they're famous and everybody talks about them.
By the way, I think we're just assuming that the audience will have some familiarity with, like, Citizen Kane, The Godfather,
These are very good films. At least that's what the IMDb Top 100 tells me. So the way that I approach it is I picked a bunch of topics and it leads from there. Like, when I first started becoming a cinephile, there was a belief that older films are not as engaging or innovative as modern day film because technique evolves. But you just watch the Adventures of Prince Ahmed from 1926, which is a German animated film done with shadow puppets, and it will still blow your mind today. And it's one of those rare films that was actually directed by a female filmmaker that's also feature-length animated, which almost never happens even to this day.
Wow, look at you, Mr. Woke. You've got a female filmmaker in here right off the bat.
And then for further research into silent cinema, and almost all the films I picked are playful in some way. You have like Murnau's Faust, The Phantom Carriage, and King Vidor's The Crowd. As far as the French New Wave goes, which is another one of those, like, you gotta watch these films, and you're like, they sound complicated.
Right.
I would recommend Zazie dans le métro. It has no English translation, and it's basically the French New Wave Zucker Brothers film, which is like, people hold giant magnets, there's like crazy stuff going all over the place. It was directed by Louis Malle, who made the exciting My Dinner with Andre, which me and Will recreate every time we record a Point Cinema Club. Film noir, The Big Clock. It's slick, it's self-contained, but it's creaky enough to have an extra layer of charm. I would recommend for Godzilla films, of course.
Oh, thank God
Hey, as a kid, I didn't get into Godzilla because I saw King Kong vs. Godzilla, and I found it boring.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I shouldn't have like yelled at that because Godzilla should be on the list. I love Godzilla.
I recommend Godzilla vs. Hedorah, which is also known as Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster, which is an interesting choice because it's an outliner to those films, which is so weird, but it has all the basic building blocks that you'll find throughout all the other films as well. Kung Fu, of course. I recommend Shaw Brothers' Dirty Ho, it's called, from 1976. It will let you into that Shaw...
Ho is the man's name.
Yes. It's a good entry point into Shaw Brothers films because they have a rhythm of their own that you don't associate with modern day martial arts, and you'll notice a lot of stuff is stolen and used into other stuff. In Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, when Ramona grabs Scott and uses him to fight someone, that's actually a gag from Dirty Ho.
Right.
That's done better because I think the guy doesn't know he's being controlled to fight the other person. Last year at Merry and Bad, which is obtuse art cinema, but it's still like dazzling even on its surface because it's so playful. Paris, Texas, because it's that kind of American indie film, even though it's directed by someone from Germany.
I almost put Paris, Texas on my list, too. I just rewatched it the other day, having not seen it for like 10 years, and I was like, damn it, I love this movie.
It's so good.
Right?
Rest in peace, Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah.
And Wim Wenders' career. Ouch. As far as the Western goes, I recommend The Great Silence by Sergio Corbucci. It's very serious, and it's set in snow, so there's that novelty factor. And then Save the Green Planet. It's probably one of my favorite South Korean films of all time. Doesn't get talked about enough. Ugh. And my last film, Watermelon Woman.
I thought you were about to say Water Power.
I thought you were going to say Waterworld.
Two great choices. All right, well, that's my list, guys. No, Watermelon Woman, which came out in 1996, was directed by Cheryl Dunyas. I'm probably saying her name wrong. Which is about a black video store attendant who wants to look into the career of a actress who would appear in the background of stuff like Gone with the Wind and things like that. It has that kind of rough-hued edge of Clerks, but at the same time, it's very thoughtful and trying to do a lot more, and nobody ever talks about it because it got a really shitty DVD release, even though that I heard from someone that it's currently being remastered and to be re-released in cinemas. So if you're like, how the fuck am I supposed to keep track of all those movies they just mentioned? I will be posting the lists on filmtrap.com, so just go there and you'll find me, Richelle, and Will's list of movies. Thank you very much, Richelle, for being on this podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
And when is the John Waters retrospective happening?
That is starting on December 7th. The first night is Multiple Maniacs and Polyester. I have got a bunch of Odorama cards from Warner, so please come, because I have like 200.
And I asked you, like, where do these Odorama cards come from?
They were just at Warner. I don't know.
So I wonder if these are, like, the original ones?
I think it's like a recreation.
Okay,
My
recreation.
DVD of Polyester
Mine
comes
too,
with
yeah.
one, but I haven't actually scratched and sniffed it.
Mine is like turning yellow.
I should just fucking scratch and
Have you
sniff
scratched and sniffed them?
Oh,
Do they
yeah.
recreate the flavors good enough?
And it's real gross.
And how long does it go for? It goes through December, right?
It goes up until December 9th. So there's 2 movies a night. December 7th, there's 2 movies. On December 8th, there's 2 movies. And on the 9th, there's 3 movies.
it. Which one is John doing the intro for?
I'm going to play the intro the whole time because it's adorable.
And is there like a pack people can buy if they want to see all of them?
Yeah, online only. There is a pass. It's $60 to see all 6 movies. Otherwise, it's $12 ahead of time or $14 at the door. So please come. Please.
So next week, Will, we're doing something that we've been talking about doing for a long time. Poverty Row.
Yes, studios like Monogram, Producers Releasing Corporation, and Republic, who in the 1940s and 30s specialized in low-budget exploitation movies for the bottom half of a double bill. I think we'll be looking at something by the Bowery Boys. We'll probably be looking at a Western.
Or Orson Welles' Macbeth,
Yes.
which he made for Republic. And I made a list that's so long, and Will was like, I just want to watch all of these.
Like, most of them are like an hour long, so I've already started.
There's one called Hitler's Madman that was directed by Douglas Sirk.
And an uncredited writer on that film, Edgar G. Elmer.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, man.
two titans collide.
Until then, my name is Dustin DeClue.
I'm Will Sloan.
I'm Richelle Charkot.
Thanks for listening.
So, Richelle, what's it like to be a programmer at the Royal Cinema?
So I used to be a social worker. I've only lived in Toronto for about 3 years, and social work was terrible. I couldn't do it.
You hated the people, right?
I hated the people.
Those unwashed.
So then I decided to start pursuing film. And yeah, I moved here, and I did my damnedest to get that job.
And what did you think you were going to do when you moved to Toronto?
I had no idea. I had an internship at Rue Morgue magazine and no job. So with the internship at Rue Morgue, they have their monthly screening series there, so I was always in the lobby. And then I started hanging out at the Royal, and then I was hired for concession, and then I was hired as a programming assistant, and then I was hired as a programming director.
I kind of get the sense that, like, you and the other programmers, like, it's almost like this fun thing where you can, like, you know, pick something you want to show, and then people will show up.
Totally, yeah. I'm really, really happy with how the last half of this year has gone as far as, like, attendance. I think everyone's kind of really hitting, like, their, like, good groove as far as programming goes.
Justin over here also programs at the Royal.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
For the Laser Blast Film Society. So now do you have some dirt that you can give us about working at the Royal?
Tell us about Tommy Wiseau. I know that he used to show the room at the Royal.
So this is pre my time, but we don't screen the room anymore because people trashed the cinema. The screen is broken because of it. Don't tell anyone. And
you can tell if it's like white on screen.
Yeah,
you can see the ghost of a stain.
yeah. And I don't know if this is just like a rumor, but I think someone like ripped up a sink in the men's bathroom because I imagine a bunch of people were on coke.
It's like the room is like cigarette burns.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They go insane.
There's a screening series which is quite popular in Toronto called Drunk Feminist Films, which are now at the Royal. I mean, and they wanted to do the room in the like wake of the Disaster Artist, but we were like, absolutely not. Like even with like a feminist spin, like no.
You know, it's the interesting thing about the room. The first time I saw it at the Royal, like in 2009, the audience was very it leaned hipster,
right?
And so you know, there's that thing that people say whenever the Lisa character does something stupid or bad, everyone shouts because you're a woman. Like it was mostly women leading that charge,
right.
Like kind of reclaiming the movie. But what I heard was, or I got the sense that as it went on, it became more bro-y.
Yeah, I can imagine. I never attended like one of the Royal ones, but I can see that happening considering all of the destruction.
So in the day-to-day of like running a cinema, because you're there like every day, right?
Yeah. I'm so because it's kind of like a family type operation. My technical title is programming director, but I also do administration and operations and marketing, and I help run events.
So you do everything.
Yeah, I'm there a lot.
Were you there when the roast of Ron Jeremy happened?
No, but that was also a disaster. I think at one point, if I'm not mistaken, one of the managers said she went backstage. I might be messing this up. It's either she saw him getting a blowjob or she went backstage and then there was just like a bunch of condoms everywhere, like used condoms.
I heard somebody say that he got a blowjob in the washroom.
Yikes.
Like if you're Ron Jeremy, aren't you just tired of that?
I feel like Ron Jeremy at this point just kind of like walks through life and you know. And then you
He's
know,
sick of blowjobs.
Perhaps a fan will come up and delighted by the novelty of blowing Ron Jeremy will offer it, and Ron Jeremy will say, "This is my life."
No one ever asked me how I'm doing.
I was really morbidly curious to go to the roast of Ron Jeremy, but tickets were $60.
That's insane.
and
this is also pre my time.
Yeah. The only announced guest was Dustin Diamond.
So what would you consider? Hey, Will, he's going to be a guest on the podcast.
Ease up.
When we do our Ron Jeremy episode.
He's going to use the same roast material, I hope you didn't pay that $60 someone. Programming at the Royal, though, do you have, like, a favorite event that you did that, like, was... I'm so glad I did that, I will never forget it.
Yeah, I mean, Pink Flamingos was a big one for me. I had a really good time doing Nightmare on Elm Street 2 for Pride. But there's been quite a few...
Like you have a series as well, right? Retropass that you program.
Yeah. I've been doing that for, I think, 2 years, I think. I don't even know. And
you do like Rod Sterling's birthday around Christmas. Like that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Last year, actually, when I did Rod Sterling Birthday Bash, that was the first year that I did it. And I closed with Time Enough at Last. And when the glasses fell down, spoilers, a bunch of people in the audience went, and I was like, oh, baby.
Wait.
I loved it.
Do you think that there's like an audience for like a rep theater in this day and age where people on their Netflixes and stuff like that?
No, I totally think so. A good example of that is anytime I've ever talked to my dad about like what's coming up as far as programming, he goes, no one's going to come to the Swimmer. 200 people came to the Swimmer. So it's like...
And it's not just like older people who can't program a DVD or something like that.
Yeah, no, totally. It's a lot of people in like their 20s, 30s
Well, the Royal is an inviting atmosphere, but also I think like because it has these curated programs, people build a sense of trust with the program.
Exactly. I think that it offers this kind of like marketing almost, where it's like if I liked, ABC of what Brendan played, then I'm likely to like D.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And even if you don't like it, probably the next one will be okay.
Yeah, sure.
And
exactly.
you won't probably regret that you've seen it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because at the Royal, you're going to see stuff on the big screen you could never see anywhere else, like She's All That. Sold out twice, 2 screenings, right?
Yeah, Phantom of the Paradise, that obscure little film.
Hey.
Brendan's throwing his earphones off, and he's like, what the fuck?